This dedication comes from the art historian Siegfried Gideon, a major figure in the historiography of modern architecture. And the date is 1937, when the East Central European representatives of SIAM, that is the International Congresses of Modern Architecture, gathered in Budapest for the first meeting of SIAM Ost, which is SIAM East. And this dedication was written on the cover of the first issue of the journal Forma, year 1937, for its editor, the architect Virgil Bierbauer. So on the left is Gideon, and on the right is Bierbauer, as the knowledgeable of the international. And my presentation focuses on the position of the architecture magazine Forma, it means space and form, and its editor, Virgil Bierbauer, in the international community of modern architects and in the international network of architecture periodicals with regards to the notions of the center and the periphery. And first about Forma. This magazine was the major and most influential architectural periodical in interwar Hungary, which was also successfully integrated into the international network of architectural journals. The journal itself was launched as the appendix of the journal called Vállalkozók Lapja, it means Contractors Journal, in 1926. And then 2 years later, in 1928, it was launched as an independent monthly periodical, and the first issue was published in May 1928. And the architects, Virgil Bierbauer and János Komor, were appointed as editors. But in 1931, János Komor resigned, and Bierbauer became the only editor, the main content provider, and the leading voice of the magazine until 1942. And after 15 years of editing the journal, Bierbauer resigned due to his join to the army in 1942. And then the magazine was taken over by an editorial board with the architect József Fischer at the helm. After the Second World War, Fischer became the president of the Metropolitan Board of Public Works in Budapest, and Forma was published by this organization. And due to the political changes in 1948, the Metropolitan Board of Public Works was shut down, and Forma ceased to be published. Here in my presentation, I will focus on the period of Bierbauer's editorship, so on the years between 1928 and 1942. In this period of 15 years, the magazine, of course, underwent a few changes, but some steady aims and practices can be pointed out. A short editorial was published in the last issue of 1928, where the editors declared their major aims. These were the followings: the importance of the inclusion of the international material to raise awareness to the global dissemination of modern architecture in Hungary. And actually, this statement also suggests that the architectural magazine was truly the major means of architectural transfer and had the ability to have an impact on the formation of architecture. The second point was this short editorial was that to show the best practices as reference points for Hungarian architects and to review continuously the Hungarian architectural production in order to record the significant steps, provide solutions, and discuss certain problems. Over the years, this goal was maintained, and especially before 1935, after the amount of the Hungarian material, a significant part of the content was international, with a European focus, of course, but also a few outlooks to America and to the Far East. Along with it, Bierbauer included the recent examples of modern architecture in Hungary. In the second half of the 1930s, the Hungarian content increasingly prevailed, but Bierbauer still reviewed the international formation of modern architecture to some, but a lesser extent. In parallel with this development, the page numbers of each issue diminished gradually due to financial reasons. In this 15 years period, the magazine presented the latest examples of architectural production and published essays on topics such as housing, interior design, and urban planning, and also reviewed books and periodicals with an international scope. To create content for Forma, Bierbauer used three major sources of information. The first was his international network of professional connections, and this network can be documented by his correspondence held at his archive at the Hungarian Museum of Architecture. This is a vast material containing approximately 900 letters in different languages, such as German, English, French, Italian, and of course Hungarian. The most well-known names in his correspondence are Alva Ártó, Marcel Breyer, Siegfried Gideon, Walter Gropius, László Moholy Nagy, Richard Neutra, and Giuseppe Terragni, among many others. The second source were his travels. Many of his travels are documented by his photographs, shown here on the slide. And also, it was also documented by the memoir of Bierbauer's wife, Adrienne Graul, who was also a Bierbauer's secretary and in many cases the writer and translator of his letters. Bierbauer also published travel reports and articles about conferences, exhibitions, and buildings which he visited during his travels. And the third source was, of course, the books and periodicals he read. His travels were limited to Europe, but according to the correspondence, he reached also the United States and some South American countries, as well as the Far East. But in summary, European orientation prevailed. Within Europe, Italy and Germany were the major focuses. Germany usually before 1933, later the German émigrés were included. And Bierbauer successfully integrated Tér és Forma into the international network of architectural journals. Editors of architectural periodicals usually didn't use visual strategies to map their networks, unlike some avant-garde journals such as Ma or L'Esprit Nouveau, as we already see in several presentations before. Here, the titles, arranged in a grid-like structure, visualize the non-hierarchical network of avant-garde art journals and express the community of interest. In L'Esprit Nouveau, there was another way of visualizing the network via projecting the subscribers on a word map, thus blurring the boundaries between readers and actors in the publication system. We rarely find anything similar in architecture periodicals, but there is a good example in the architectural magazine Domus, which was edited by Gio Ponti at that time, so between 1928 and 41, so roughly the same time as Bierbauer. And in many issues of Domus, their scope was indicated with the title Migliori idee dalla rivista di tutto il mondo, meaning that Domus chose the best ideas from journals from all over the world to its readers. It is only typographically separated from other contents in the magazine, but still visually parted. In Tér és Forma, this network can be traced only by the review sections in the journal, where Bierbauer's scope of interest can be seen. Bierbauer was, of course, in contact with magazine editors from the international scene, and they exchanged their journals with each other. Here I give you a few examples from his correspondence, like the Forum journal from Bratislava, the Achtenopbau from the Netherlands, Das Werk from Zurich, Casabella and Architettura from Italy, and Kokusai Kenchiku from Japan, and there are some others. And with these visual typographical strategies, or just with the review section, magazine strengthened the idea of an international movement and common goals, and each new actor of this publication system put an effort to be a part of it, and Tér és Forma was no exception. The main audience of Tér és Forma was, of course, the Hungarian architectural scene, but Bierbauer also targeted the international arena. In Hungary, Tér és Forma became the most influential architectural magazine of the interwar period and was also one of the most progressive. It was also under the radar of other Hungarian architectural magazines, which often reacted on disputes and discussions in Tér és Forma. Like this is the case in the mostly conservative journal Építőmunka, means construction work, where the most progressive group of Hungarian architects were criticized based on their appearances in Tér és Forma. Tér és Forma also created a platform which inspired architects and designers. Here you can see some sketches from Hungarian architects based on what they spotted in Tér és Forma. This one is from Lajos Kozma after a theater in Sweden. And this is by László Gerő, who drew some furniture after Gyula case. So although the main audience comprised of Hungarian architects and designers, Bierbauer targeted the international scene. He sometimes specifically mentioned in Téres Forma that the journal opened up to the public of foreign professionals to Hungarian architecture, and thus many cases foreign magazines request materials based on what was published in Téres Forma. To reach international readership, Bierbauer used the usual strategies. Téres Forma was a highly illustrated magazine, and Bierbauer used photography as a universal language, so he consistently used professional architectural photographs from both Hungary and abroad. Usually, one series of professional photographs were taken of the new buildings, and these sets of images circulated internationally, making appearances in specific journals internationally. He sometimes inserted captions, summaries, and at times whole articles in English, German, French, or Italian. These languages also appeared on the new cover design of 1935, which lasted until 1943. The transfer of information sometimes can be followed. I give you a few examples here. There are direct transfers from Téres Forma with indicating the reference. These are examples from the Italian magazine Domus, the French L'Architecture d'aujourd'hui, and the Japanese Shinkanchiku. And of course, there are also indirect ways of information transfer from Téres Forma with actors in between. And of course, there are cases of information transfer regardless of Téres Forma. Either in case of direct or indirect information transfer, the role of an agent is also needed to be considered. Of course, the most important agent here was the editor, that is Virgil Bierbauer in case of Téres Forma. And in a subjective way, his acquaintances, his broader professional circles, and his travels all shaped the content of Téres Forma. He also oriented himself by reading piles of architecture journals monthly, as he and his colleagues recalled about him. And as editor, he could approach foreign architects without referring to any previous connection. Therefore, bias and personal interest can be detected in many cases. For example, we can see buildings that we know that Bierbauer visited. There are other buildings that Bierbauer personally appreciated, as it is known due to his papers and documents. And of course, there are other topics in which we personally interested, etc. In many cases, the human element was much more important than preconceived ideas about centers and central figures of the modern movement. And turning back to information transfer, another important agent is the correspondent, who worked sometimes regardless of magazine editors. Here is a British example, Dexter Moran, an architecture critic working for magazines internationally. He was in correspondence with Hungarian architects like the architect József Fischer, as this is an example in the slide. And there is a Hungarian example, György Masirevics, a Hungarian correspondent of the French journal L'Architecture d'aujourd'hui. And this journal was also a special case with its Budapest-born editor, Pierre Vágó, who had Hungarian connections in his own right, and his father, József Vágó, was also one of the patrons and contributors of the journal. And of course, and architects also acted as agents of their own work. Sometimes they were approached directly by magazine editors, correspondents, or vice versa. Here's an example of József Fischer, who was in contact with the Spanish journal Viviendas in 1934. Or another example is the architect Zoltán Kósa with Moderne Bauformen from 1931, and of course there are some others. And finally, professional organizations and groups also acted as agents of information transfer. With regards to modern architecture, SIAM, so the International Congresses of Modern Architecture, which I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, was probably the most important among these organizations. Within SIAM circles, the information about the most progressive branch of Hungarian modern architecture spread. For example, it is known that the Hungarian SIAM group circulated the SIAM issues of Tér és Forma to other national SIAM groups and to the SIAM secretary. These mechanisms of information transfer shape both the content of Tér és Forma and the dissemination of Hungarian architecture to a global, but of course mostly European scene. But to align with the major topic of this conference, two major questions can be addressed here. First, what was the position of Tér és Forma in the international network of architectural periodicals? And second, how central was Bierbauer's position with regards to the dissemination of Hungarian architecture towards the international arena? If we consider the network of architectural periodicals, it is indisputable that Tér és Forma was the #1 reference point with regards to the modern architecture of Hungary. But of course, the transfer of information was not limited to Tér és Forma and architectural periodicals. As I have already showed during my presentation, other agents also acted as mediators, and the human factor was very crucial, so good friendships and also random encounters could equally create publication materials. Thus, it's also important to research personal archives and see which connections were more important than others. Of course, in a case of an internationally disseminated magazine, it's a mission impossible to conduct research in every relevant country and archive, so I'm making a selection of those crucial figures whose archival material is relevant, accessible, and of considerable size, and hopefully still representative of the structure of this figures network. And there is no time here to delve deeply into these subjects. I just give you a few examples here, and I also point out certain recurring patterns. So, Le Corbusier, Alberto Sartoris, and Siegfried Gideon, they all represent the centers of the networks of the modern movement in architecture. Le Corbusier as a Swiss-French architect, Alberto Sartoris as an Italian, Swiss architect and who published important corpuses of modern architecture, and Siegfried Gideon as an art historian and author of many publications about housing, living, and modern architecture. So they represent real centers of the networks. So we can say that these are the nodes of the centers of the modern movement in architecture. But of course, in a Hungarian relation, Bierbauer is also a prominent center, a central figure in Hungarian relations, and knowledgeable, as Gideon said, of international relations with direct links to the major central figures of modern architecture. Beside Bierbauer, the Hungarian SIAM group is also a significant player, especially the group leader Farkas Molnár and the second delegate, the architect József Fischer. And finally, there is usually other players in the network who are linked to certain figures due to friendships. This is the case of the architect József Molnár, who was in very good relation with Alberto Sartoris, or Le Corbusier's Hungarian apprentices, for example. And finally, I would like to say a few words about the canon of modern architecture in relation to the center and periphery. There were certain figures of the modern movement who strengthened the idea of an international style in architectural modernism, like, for example, the immigrants who immigrated to the English-speaking world, such as former Bauhauslers to the UK and the United States, like Walter Gropius and Marcel Breuer, and also Mies van der Rohe, who in their works, especially in the United States, they really strengthened an idea of an international style in architectural modernism. And there's also the formerly mentioned Alberto Sartoris, a Swiss-Italian architect, who published 6 comprehensive corpuses about modern architecture, grouping the buildings according to countries and aiming at their canonization. All these efforts cemented the canonical status of progressive, functionalist modern architecture. And of course, Tér és Forma also published many of these pieces of modern architecture. As you can see, some canonical buildings, which were already iconic in the 1930s, like the Fannelle factory in Rotterdam, or the Paimio Sanatorium by Alvar Aalto, or Richard Neutra's experimental housing around Los Angeles. But Bierbauer was also consistent throughout his 15 years as editor to show that there are local achievements as well and local characteristics within the modern movement, which is supposed to be international. Thus, perhaps Bierbauer's major achievement with Tér Forma is that he tried to canonize also the local, to put the local in a central position. Here I give you an example of Iván Kocsis, who was an architect who built many villas, family houses around Lake Balaton. And he considered the local climate of Lake Balaton, and this idea had an effect on his architecture. And Bierbauer acknowledged the importance of this idea and tried to canonize these local ideas. And if Bierbauer was successful, even actors moving on the periphery of network systems could be brought to a central position for a longer or shorter time with a fortunately placed press appearance, which could later determine their place in the canon. I thank you for your attention.